Thanks for coming. Okay, well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. My name is Amelia Regan. I'm the director of the Supply Chain, Transportation, and Logistics program at the University of Washington. Today, we're going to talk about humanitarian logistics. So it's the branch of our field that specializes in organizing the delivery and warehousing of supplies during natural disasters or other emergencies affecting large groups of people. It's not a topic we teach in our program, but many students have expressed an interest in learning more. So first, let me thank all of you, Professor Özlem Ergun from Northeastern, and Kathy Fulton and Alan Van Boven from the Logistics Aid Network. I'll also mention that Alan was for many years a beloved instructor in our master's program. And I'd like to start by having our distinguished panel introduce themselves and tell us a bit about your connections to this topic of humanitarian logistics. So why don't we, Alan, why don't we start with you since you joined us first today?
Uh-oh, okay. My name is Alan Van Boven, and let's see, I'll give you some quick background and then I'll talk a little bit more about my relationship with humanitarian logistics. I spent most of my career in wireless telecommunications until about 1998. Then I took over a transportation management system, which was brand new to me in 1998 until 2008 when I sold it. And then I did some consulting. And then I became an affiliate faculty member of the University of Washington's Supply Chain, Transportation, Logistics, SCTL, which Amelia can talk at great length about, I'm sure. I have also been on the faculty at Lake Washington Institute of Technology, same topic, similar degree, but it's an undergrad degree. And I've also been on several advisory boards in supply chain education, still am. The University of Washington SCTL board, Western Washington University's advisory board in, let's see, manufacturing and supply chain management, and Lake Washington board. So 3 different boards that I'm part of. And I've been part of Allen as the regional director since 2017. So that's how long I knew Kathy. I am the director of what we call Region 10. Our regions are modeled after FEMA's regions. So this is the same as the FEMA Region 10, which consists of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And occasionally I've had to dabble in Northern California in the Paradise Fire, for example. That was really a disaster. So now, for the most part, I'm retired. And what I do in as a director, I help coordinate responses to humanitarian logistics needs in fires. A couple of times it's been floods, and the one thing that hasn't happened yet, fortunately, but probably will someday, is an earthquake. Those are the big 3 that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. A 4th would be a volcanic eruption, which there are several quite active volcanoes around here. Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, Mount St. Helens still active, exploded once, for those of you who might remember. And so they're somewhat different disasters than you might see in other parts of the country, which Kathy can explain. But the earthquake possibilities here are probably not that dissimilar to what we saw in the Turkey-Syria situation in terms of potential magnitude, hopefully less wreckage and destruction and life lost, but there could be all of the above, depending on the magnitude of the earthquake. All right, enough out of me.
Thanks. Let's go to Kathy.
All right, thanks, Amelia. Good. I guess it's afternoon for everyone now at this point. I'm Kathy Fulton. I serve as the Executive Director of American Logistics Aid Network, or we just call ourselves ALAN. So hopefully there will not be too much confusion between ALAN and ALAN. on today's call. But we're a nonprofit that serves as a coordinator for logistics services. So we're going to work with the nonprofits who are on the ground doing disaster relief and help them access donated or discounted logistics services, equipment, and expertise. And we also work to help bridge the gap between businesses and government emergency management agencies. So we'll help to share information with the business community about what actions government is taking, and especially the impact of those actions. And then we'll also work with government to help them understand how their actions, whatever they may be, either support or disrupt supply chain flow. So I'll pause there and let Özlem introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Özlem Ergun. I'm a faculty member in industrial engineering. So I spent the first part of my career at Georgia Tech and then moved to Northeastern. So at Georgia, my background really by training, I'm a network optimizer. So I come from a fairly algorithmic methodological background, but I have early on developed an interest in humanitarian logistics, emergency management, and have been working in this area for more than a decade and a half at this point. And at Georgia Tech, I developed, I co-started the Health and Humanitarian Logistics Center with Pinar and Julie, for those of you who might know them. And then what I do is I do different things in this context, but I'm more interested in solving the real problems than necessarily working in one part of a problem or using necessarily one type of methodology. So over the last decade and a half, I worked with a bunch of United Nations organizations. I worked with FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, USAID, and a bunch of other nonprofits. I know Kathy very well. We've served on a couple of committees together, and as kind of also a related topic to today, related thing to today's topic is I actually come from Turkey, and my hometown is actually in the affected area. So I have been quite involved in what's going on, both personally, but also trying to see what can be done. Thank you.
Wow, that's heavy. So thank you for coming, and I'm sorry that your family was affected or your friends are affected. So this recent earthquake in Turkey and Syria was probably the worst humanitarian disaster in decades. And, the scale of the response has been impressive, but many individuals and families are likely to remain unhoused and unsafe for years. And of course, it's complicated further by the fact that Syria has had a civil war raging for, I think, a dozen years now. But have there been some bright spots in the response in this unprecedented emergency?
I don't know. I'm too close to it. I'm going to have a hard time saying, finding a bright spot. But I might say that there's actually a huge international effort, that kind of a big community got mobilized, especially early on in the earlier days for search and rescue. I think there were, I've seen the numbers, but I've actually forgotten, but many different types of international agencies, countries have actually responded by sending teams. And I think that was one of the bright spots. How they were managed and not coordinated was unfortunately ended up making it very ineffective, but at least there was a huge show of, okay, we'll be there and try to help.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Özlem said. I don't know if you read off any of the statistics, Amelia. It's heartbreaking. 50,000 people killed, 1.5 million or so displaced. It is heart-wrenching, and Dr. Ergun says, we have seen this tremendous global response I know we're going to talk about some of the challenges here in a minute. I'll also say that, not just the government response around the world has been impressive, but also the business response. We've seen, and there are also bad things to that as well. So some bad things have happened, but there is this outpouring of support and dedication to not just the immediate needs, but helping with reconstruction and long-term response activities. And I think that that's what you want to see. You want to see government and business communities, both, and individuals and others, the NGO community, responding well to it. But there have been some coordination challenges as well.
So that leads into the next question was, and I hope I haven't, this phrasing is okay, but where has the international aid community fallen short, or where could we have done better in response?
Özlem, I'll start because I know you have such a much better perspective on this. But
actually not on the international side. So I like you to start. I think you have a better perspective on that. Well, yeah.
I'll just unfortunately, the same problems that we see with U.S. domestic disasters, we have unfortunately seen repeated with with the earthquakes. And those are things like people who want to help but don't know how to help well, sending things that are really not needed. A colleague of Özlem and mine, Nezialte, has been posting videos and photos of just the horrible things that people are sending. And when I say horrible, I mean things that are not needed. You don't need a beaded ball gown if you've just been through an earthquake, and people are literally sending used clothing, things like that. I also know that while there's this generous commitment of funding to help support, some of that funding has been very slow to be released. And a lot of the supply chains were destroyed. Ultimately, I think we're all kind of supply chain transportation people here. The disruption to those supply chains means that sometimes that funding is not what's needed immediately. But even still, the commitments, getting those funds released so that where supply chains do exist, they can be accessed has been a challenge. So, Özlem, I'll pause there.
I think everything that you said, Kathy, is true. I would say, again, in this one, actually, I'm kind of very unusually focused on the local side. So I have seen a lot of the local issues. I think in a way that the international efforts were not being very well directed or guided by the local authorities. And I think that has also been an issue. There was a lot of, in the very beginning, there's a lot of issues around like whom to donate. Like we've had so many people asking us, for example, where do you donate? Like there wasn't even like a very clear message of where to donate and how to do what. And I would say there's actually very little visibility of international agencies. I don't know if you would say this is true or not, but like compare that to like some of the other big global disasters. Like I think we had much more call for donations and aid, like larger calls or more visible calls by the international agencies. What I have seen was kind of like, I didn't see much by international agencies. And I was like wondering if that was really coming from the fact that they were really not even invited, or even if they were invited under many conditions, or things like just come and give us money and we're not gonna like let you do anything else. And so I don't know what all the politics were, but I thought like actually the international agencies which were much less visible in this case than you would see in another place with such a huge outcome.
Yeah, and there certainly were challenges with how your aid has to flow. It has to flow through certain government sources, and that that presents a challenge for some international nonprofits who are accustomed to having a little more ability to do things the way that they've always done things. So certainly that's a challenge, but even still, Özlem, I agree. It's hard to get that visibility. I mean, you can look at the logistics cluster kind of information that they put out. Right. And even still, I would expect a more rich conversation around some of these things, but yeah.
So that brings up another question. So clearly the needs are going to persist. And the needs, and when you look at, problems in the US, well, Puerto Rico, Florida, we've had some natural disasters where the needs have persisted for a long time, but somehow the story gets out of the public view, both in the press and sort of in conversation. And this is clearly going to be a long-term recovery that's going to be needed. What do you think that, I don't know, organizations or individuals can do to keep this sort of in the forefront?
I mean, again, I don't know, I'm going to have a more local perspective here. I think there needs to be, and this is still so new. I mean, it's not like we're not past the initial stage yet. Like people are still on the streets, and even though there are some like temporary, sheltering available here and there, a lot of the people are not even going to the like there's so many issues on the ground right now that actually people are suffering almost as much as they were suffering in the beginning. But I think what really needs to be happening is more of an organized effort of kind of assessment, and then kind of translation of that assessment into what is needed and what are the plans, right? Like, I think there is, even for people who are living in the area, but we're more fortunate, like we actually get information about what is needed from our friends who are on the ground. And then people are still trying to kind of make adjustments on what needs to be sent or what is needed from these ad hoc networks. And I think what you really need is a much more organized effort into assessment and a planning, and then kind of an explanation of here's the need and this is what we need. I don't know. Again, coming from a very personal, it's hard to get not be very close to this.
Yeah, and I'll say two things. So first, Amelia, you mentioned this is already starting to be out of the news, right? People internationally are paying much less attention to it than they were immediately after it happened. And some of it is, hey, that happened overseas, it doesn't concern me. I don't need to worry about that, right? And we tend to focus hyper locally. But I think what Özlem points to is the fact that the best information is always going to come from what is available locally. And the true needs are going to come from what's available locally. So as anyone, and I took a peek at some of the attendee on the call, and so yes, I'm talking to you, Puget Sound area emergency managers, having a plan for how you're going to wrap that local emergent response efforts. It's not just going to be your big NGOs. It's not just going to be government. It's not just going to be business, but it's going to be the people on the ground, and figuring out how do you take from what they're telling you and translate that into needs, translate that into things that can be responded to. Those are your demand signals. What Özlem is talking about is the demand signals that are literally coming from the people on the ground telling you, hey, we need shelter, we need food, we need whatever. But translating that up through to someone who can provide for it is something that has to be planned for and put into advance ahead of time, ahead of time.
I have a question on that topic, and maybe either you or Kathy or Dr. Ergun have some advice. Oftentimes, local groups like a group of Turkish people or even Syrian people in the Seattle or Puget Sound area, they're eager to respond. Is there a vehicle or a channel that they can direct that through? Should they go through local emergency management or NGOs? Or because I think they run into that problem because they have an eagerness because they relate and they're oftentimes related to some of the people there, but they, in this case, I suspect don't know what to do, and I've seen that in the news around here too. They're not quite sure what to do or where to go, and that's not always true in other parts of the world where there's,
Yeah,
Like-
and that's what I was like trying to say in the beginning. It wasn't really clear how to help, and I would say
yeah.
it's still not clear. Part of it is because there's also a lot of political unrest in the country, and there's a lot of there's a huge mistrust to the authorities, and the authorities are trying to absolutely funnel everything through themselves, and that has created a lot of tension. So again, I mean, my personal opinion is almost like help in multiple ways, right? So some of it will go through. So I would say, I mean, I personally did give to large organizations, because large international, very well-known organizations, just because, I kind of trust them, I work with them. But I have also given to some Turkish charities, and also given some kind of personal local, and then I've also taken the Turkish consulate, for example, in Boston was collecting materials, and we have actually bought and took materials there too, just so I was kind of a mixed strategy, take multiple things. But I think unfortunately, this is one of those situations that there is also this kind of a challenge in terms of whom do you trust and how does it go. And then on the Syrian case, so this was all about the Turkish case. Of course, the Syrian case, it's even worse, right? Because there's no access, even the large organizations are not getting access through due to, again, all those political issues. And so again, I think I would say at the end of the day, I was trusting international agencies more than anything else, either international agencies or the people I know in locally on the ground, that seemed more safe to me than anything else. But I don't know, Kathy, maybe you have a different perspective.
Well, the only thing, well, I have lots of perspectives, but I will say, going to your local emergency manager, no, you asked that, Alan, that's not something that they're,
I didn't think so.
Yeah, that's not something that they're positioned to do, especially for international emergencies. The collecting supplies, we see that over and over again where it causes a problem. The consulate in Boston and the consulate in DC have done these large collection drives, but they had already planned ahead of time how they're going to get those supplies there and planned how they're going to distribute them. So, urging people that you can't just collect a bunch of stuff and then try to figure out how to get it there. We see that time and time again. It's not going to be effective or efficient, because if, you're collecting water today because someone says, hey, we need bottled water, by the time you can collect enough and ship it, it's not going to be needed anymore, most likely. So
Is the Red Cross effective in Turkey and possibly even in Syria? Do either of you know?
I can tell you the Turkish situation. So it's Red Crescent in Turkey. And so as you might know, the Red Crescent organization is a very localized and decentralized organization. And as part of their charter, they actually encourage the local organizations to kind of work very closely with the government, because their belief is that if you're closely working with the government, then you're more effective in your local context. However, it turns out we just learned, like in Turkey, like the Red Crescent organization had been really kind of hollowed out, and actually it turned out that it was turned into 9 for-profit companies, and there was like this whole scandal of how things were actually being sold out of Red Crescent to aid agencies for profit, and I think this is the whole thing is so dire right now that the international organization is actually thinking like kicking the Turkish organization out. So it's, you know, again, like, I mean, normally, traditionally, Red Crescent used to be very strong in Turkey, but again, like there's that kind of, you know, like if you're close to the government, you work maybe more effectively for the beneficiaries, but then if you're too close to the government and there are issues, then you might end up being completely ineffective, I suppose, as we have seen in this case.
So we're going to move on to some, you know, more news-based questions, but there's a question from the
Amelia,
audience.
it's hard to hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry, there's a question from the audience that I want to see if we can address before we move on. So Angel Cortez asks, besides the basic fundamental needs such as water, food, shelter, from what you've seen, what are the needs of the population? Perhaps some things that planners wouldn't have thought of.
I'll let one of you speak first.
Well, I actually am very curious to hear what you're thinking or what you're hearing from your family and friends, you know, in Turkey.
So, I mean, you know, food, water, shelter, of course, is the first things. Sanitation has been a huge issue, very big issue, like sanitary products, and even like water has been like not just drinking water, but like water for sanitation has been a huge issue because there has been no kind of setup for you know, kind of, again, like sanitation, taking baths, you know, like there's really like there has been no opportunities for cleaning, basically. And what that led into is like basically people would just like throw away clothes and everything that's just like so dirty that it's not wearable anymore. So like there's like has been a lot of need for clean clothes, a lot of sanitation materials, you know, and so this is not on the material side, but what I've been also hearing on the ground is that even if there is stuff on the ground, it is just not being distributed in terms of like the last mile. And apparently the strategy that the government is following right now is to really just take the stuff as a bulk and bring it to the container cities or the, you know, the tent cities. And it turns out like in an earthquake situation like this, a lot of the people still want to stay next to the apartments or the houses that were their houses that crumbled down, right? So apparently there are a lot of people who are still just in the rubble, right? They just want to live there because either, you know, all their material, like all their, you know, livelihood, all their valuables, everything is still under the rubble, or their loved ones are under the rubble, or they like just want to stay in their yard rather than go to a shelter city. And so there has been kind of no sensitivity or any effort in terms of trying to like see where the people are and take this like the food and the water at least to them. Like it's really the strategy has been like, if you want to get anything, you just have to come here. And that has been like one of the biggest things that I actually hear from like really from the ground, that like people go hungry and without water because they don't know how to get it. Like it's just not there.
Yeah, Özlem, I mean, I think talking about those realities of sanitation, of medical, you know, we do, I mean, even in US domestic disasters, we see that over and over where people just, they don't want to leave. You know, I wouldn't discount the the need for emotional, spiritual care.
Exactly.
Especially the situation you're talking about where they don't want to leave, and they don't want to leave to go even take care for themselves, because of the shock. So I think, Angel, as we look at, the possibilities of a Cascadia or something else, in Washington State and the whole region, there's so much unaccounted for in the plans. You can't plan for everything, right? So planning to be flexible and planning to be creative when something happens. And those are skills that can be practiced, through whatever means, but that flexibility and that adaptability, I think are things that that maybe are not being thought of and need to be.
So, so closer to home, we've had, hardly a week goes by in the US without some kind of natural disaster, wildfires. We were talking about the Paradise Fire before we started. In 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and the nearby islands, and they have not completely recovered from that 5 years later. Just last year, Hurricane Ian swept through Florida, leaving many residents unhoused 6 months later. So these things happen in the US. And then in even just last week, right, there were tornadoes ripped through parts of Mississippi and, downing buildings, imperiling lives. And the heavy rains in California, Northern California, have led to some near misses with respect to gas lines that might result in additional displacement. So I guess two questions. What do we do about all these displacements that we have in the US as a result of natural disasters? Particularly, there are many parts of the US where we don't have excess housing. And we're not really prepared. I think we almost think it's not going to happen here, but it happens here all the time. The question is, how do we meet the housing needs of people who are displaced by these disasters?
I don't really know much about that, so I don't know if Kathy or Alan.
Alan, you have anything you want to weigh in here?
Well, that's an interesting question. I really haven't addressed that part of it because I've focused mostly on the logistics, but it's a very potent question and certainly will be very dominant in an earthquake situation, because there will be a lot of people that will be displaced for some time to come. I think the government agencies are going to be the key resource to look at solutions to that, but I think there has to be more preparation than there is to date, to my knowledge, and I've been somewhat involved in the planning that we've done around earthquake stuff. There hasn't been a lot of attention devoted to where are the displaced people going to go and live, and even where are they going to get food supplies, water, and so forth. There's a lot of work on, because one of the assumptions in the big earthquakes is that pretty much all the roads or many of the roads will be wiped out, especially in the Pacific Northwest, because of the nature of the soil and everything else. It's kind of like sitting on jello. And these roads will not be and where do you go? And I particularly have a concern with the lower socioeconomic people and even the homeless people. How are they going to get around or get housing or any kind of care, including food and water? Because I know there's been a lot of work in the FEMA exercises that were done. There's been a lot of work on restoring and replenishing the big chain stores, the Kroger stores around, and Costco and so forth. And those are all great. But if you live in a lower South Seattle, you aren't going to get to one of those very quickly or at all. I personally believe that we need to pay more attention to and work more and I'm going to take some initiative to do this, work with the food banks and food pantries and the food security distributors, because they're going to be a key link in that whole chain to supply a lot of people.
Yeah. And
I didn't have an
Amelia-
answer for the question.
No,
about
no, I mean, Amelia, you asked about housing, and it is a complex issue. As you mentioned, we have people who are unhoused now because of the lack of affordable housing, right? I read a statistic last week that, housing, I live on the kind of in Florida. Anything east of the Mississippi, housing rates are just increasing, rapidly. I see it around us all the time. So, we have that challenge ahead of time. Disasters, and especially catastrophic events like like what's happened in Turkey and Syria, it create a whole host of newly unhoused people. I was at a conference earlier this week where someone said, FEMA doesn't do housing well. And honestly, I don't know that any government agency does housing well. And that's not a knock on them. It's just, that's not a core mission, right? So where are those capabilities going to come from? Well, they're going to come from the community organizations who are already the organizations that are already operating within your communities, right? So whether that's the Habitat for Humanity or the housing groups, the housing nonprofits who are there to help, those people need to be brought to the table now. To have these conversations, rather than saying, well, that's what they do. They're not part of us. They're not part of the core mission. Everyone should have a seat at the table. And housing is something that, without safe shelter, pretty much, everything else doesn't matter.
And definitely, I think we need to plan for different scales of disasters, because, I mean, in most of the recent disasters that we see we have seen in the United States, although there were some devastating ones, housing, you could think about future housing in the same place, but just kind of rebuilding and helping to rebuild. So, I mean, what we see in Turkey right now is pretty much it's just not a possibility. It is the whole place is devastated. And I'm afraid that might happen also with the earthquake that we're thinking about in the Pacific Northwest, right? The damage is so big that even taking the debris out of the location will take 2 to 5 years, and so you can't really think about rebuilding at the same place. So then that's a completely different planning process, right? That's completely different than a hurricane went through and we have to rebuild what we can. Even then it might be different, but there are really different scales that you have to plan for, and some of them are, as Kathy is saying, none of these are really core emergency management actions. Temporary shelter, yes, but kind of long-term sheltering is not really their core business at all.
Yeah, I was thinking about the people who've been displaced in Florida, in Fort Myers, for example, are still many of them are unhoused. So, and I see housing. I'm not a housing expert, but housing is sort of related. If we don't know where the people are, we can't deliver the goods and services, as was pointed out earlier. So, so our students have been asking, what are the ways that members of the broader logistics community could learn more about humanitarian crises and humanitarian logistics, and then perhaps get involved either as professionals or on a volunteer basis?
That's a really good question. I don't have a good answer, but I think we do need more educational material on this, not necessarily entire quarter-long classes, but specific sessions addressing specific topics. And I mentioned earlier I think it was before all the people got on. There's right now, for example, a course being given by the Tacoma Transportation Club along with Pierce County Emergency Management on business preparation. And one thing that they always comment on, if the business is not prepared and isn't able to help itself survive, the people that work in that business won't be able to help anybody else either. And so business continuity and business preparedness in a disaster, I can send information on that course. I was just looking at it a few minutes ago, and I'm going to sign up to one. There's one coming up. It's a 2-hour course in May 10, another one in April, and then there are some after that. They would be valuable starting points.
Yeah, and Özlem, I don't know if you want to go next.
I mean, I would say also, consider getting jobs in this area. I mean, I think this is one of the, one of those things where we don't really have kind of analytically trained or system trained professionals go into this area in both in government and non-governmental agencies. And honestly, these agencies, it used to be that these agencies didn't look for people who had analytical and computing and other modeling type of skills, but now they are actually, I very often do get, like messages from colleagues who are working in these sectors saying like, we're looking for such a person, such and such a person, right? It's very hard for them to hire in these, they are finding it harder to hire people with these skills. So if you're really interested, I think I would say definitely considering applying for these jobs and working with them, working for them. I mean, you can always like try to do some research, do volunteer, but it really depends. Like, I mean, what commitment do you have, right? Like, do you really want to do this for life, or you want to just kind of help out if something happens and the strategy is going to be different?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, Amelia, I think you asked about, how can you learn more about it? How can you get involved? And I'll just add to what Alan and Özlem have both said in that, there's a lot of free training material that's out there. The Fritz Institute has great material. Özlem started, along with Julian Pinar, started the Institute at Georgia Tech. There's a group called Disaster Ready, which provides lots of free trainings. There's tons of free FEMA trainings that are out there. But I think, just kind of to add to what Özlem said, that there's lots of hands-on ways that you can even get involved. Just locally, taking and going to your local food bank or food pantry and, applying the things that you're learning in your coursework or that you're doing, in your daily job as a logistician to the humanitarian space, right? They need that because, nonprofits typically don't get started because they have a great idea on how to do logistics better. They get started because a founder has a passion for a particular area of interest, right? So those are some ways. I'll also put a plug in for our organization, American Logistics Aid Network. We do use volunteer support, as Alan Van Boven is aware of. It's just another hands-on way to get involved and listen in and participate, even if it just means you're sitting in on a conversation and taking notes for us. That's going to help you learn more about the humanitarian environment.
That's great. So we're coming to the end. I want to, first of all, just thank you for your participation and your insights in the last few minutes that we have. Yeah, so we have a question. What are some of the key performance indicators in this space, and how do we measure success?
I mean, I'll say like it depends. I mean, it kind of depends from agency to agency, but I would say cost effectiveness is a big issue. Like a lot of the agencies are trying to adopt, right? So serving as fast and as many people as you can, but in a cost effective way, because that also means, you know, you're serving more and better. But it's a good question. Like, I know that, for example, I had a PhD student who worked with UN World Food Program just on a KPI project for years, and it was actually a tough project, because even within WFP, different groups within WFP had completely different ideas about how performance should be measured, right? Like if you go and talk to a nutritionist, they have a very different KPI model in their head, versus if you talk to a logistician, they have a very different KPI model. So I think it is not just one measure, and it is, I mean, I think like even doing KPI projects in these organizations is a really good thing to do, because then you bring a lot of different functions together and make them have a conversation around what are the different types of KPIs you should actually be looking at and worrying about, other than just like number of people in number of days. Right?
Yeah, KPIs are often difficult to capture as well, because how do you count the cost of a life not lost, right? It's difficult to prove that the work that you have done. So a lot of times, you know, we end up talking about our output metrics rather than our outcome metrics. And so output would be like number of truckloads moved, or number of, you know, meals served in a humanitarian situation, when really it is, hey, you know, if we hadn't been there, what would have happened? And that's much more difficult to measure. But other metrics are like, you know, speed, as I mentioned, cost, things like that are always, some of those corporate metrics are still important in the humanitarian space, but they do differ in, I was just thinking, like, Özlem, you're the network design person, like, warehousing versus transportation. It's, you're always going to default to the transportation spend in a humanitarian situation, because it's just so much more necessary. So.
Are there any last thoughts? We're getting thank you from the crowd, so that's nice.
That is nice.
Okay, well, I just want to say we very much appreciate your time today and your expertise. I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I know there's going to be lots of talk about it afterwards. So thank you very much for coming.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Amelia.
Thank you, Amelia, for coordinating and putting this on. Maybe you and I can get together, since we're both local here in Seattle.
I think we will. I think we will, Alan. Yeah, I can
Yeah.
drive to Tacoma to do some work up there too. It's not too far from me.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we can strategize on how we can kind of make this more continuous, continuum, because I think the need is there and the interest is there. I think there's a lot of people interested, and they just really don't know how to get involved and how they can help. So I've really appreciated this.
Okay, I guess we're gonna sign off, Katie. Thanks
All right, bye.
very much, guys.
Bye. Thank you.